Welcome to Pick Up and Deliver, the podcast where I pick up my audio recorder as I head out for a walk and deliver an episode to you while I stroll around. I'm Brendan Riley. Well, good afternoon, listeners. It is a lovely day here in suburban Chicago, and I'm on my way home from library and running errands. I found some nice Christmas gifts for both my mom and my wife. I'm not going to say what they are because I know sometimes my mom listens to this podcast and I don't want to give it away. Caught you, Mom. But I am going to talk about the holidays. So I'm recording this on December 21st. It is winter here in Chicago, although it feels like late autumn, honestly. It feels like late November in this kind of weather, but it is wintry. And so I was thinking about what kinds of games I wanted to talk about. I thought about games I might take home to show the family. I feel like that's an overdone topic. I've seen that a lot. And you know me, I always like to do a theme storm. I know I've done a Christmas theme storm before. So I thought maybe off the top of my head, instead of that, I would do giving. Games that embody the spirit of giving. Well, not really, but the giving part. So I'm working from Miracle on 34th Street, which is my favorite Christmas movie. If you haven't seen it, I'm sorry, I'm going to spoil it here. You can skip ahead, let's say 2 minutes, if you don't want to hear the plot. In the Miracle on 34th Street, a man gets a job working as Santa Claus at Macy's, and then they discover that he believes himself to be Santa Claus. His name is Kris Kringle. He's kind and jolly, and he thinks he's Santa Claus. Now, at first, that doesn't seem to be a problem. The old folks' home where he lives, the guy says, this is just a delusion, it's fine, and he's a great Santa Claus, so they keep him working there. But this curmudgeonly, I don't know what you'd call him, personality psychiatrist person who works for Macy's decides that he's crazy and apt to become violent and gets him thrown into Bellevue. And then there's a trial to see whether or not he is Santa Claus or not. And one of the things I like about the movie, I think is so funny about it, is that in the end, the court finds that he is in fact Santa Claus because the U.S. Postal Service says that he's Santa Claus. But throughout the movie, there are a number of places where different people assert, yes, he's definitely Santa Claus, not because he's kind and good and jolly, but because it serves their self-interest. Fred likes him, certainly, and I'm not trying to pick apart the movie, but Fred also talks about the only fun in law is cases where people are being kicked around, like Chris. And so Fred sees this as he enjoys the challenge of the case and defending Chris, so there is some self-interest there. Mr. Macy gets called to the stand, and the DA asks, do you believe that Kris Kringle is the one and only Santa Claus? And Macy imagines in his head all of these newspaper reports where they say, you're gonna, Macy admits Santa Claus a fraud, so he says, I do believe that. And they show him reflecting on, how nice Kris Kringle is too, but you can't ignore the negative motivation he has for saying, yes, it's Santa Claus. And the same goes for the judge, who doesn't want to lose his job as a judge. And the same goes for the DA. Even though the DA has to prosecute, he doesn't really want to. And as soon as he has the reasonable way to concede the case, he will. And then you have the post office, who ends up being the decision maker. And the post office ends up bringing Chris a bunch of dead letters. They just want to clear out all the dead letters out of the dead letter office. And instead, they end up providing governmental proof that Kris Kringle is Santa Claus. So what we have is this confluence of people with enlightened self-interest who end up engaging the spirit of the season, which is giving. And of course, Chris himself engages in that. So anyway, what I want to talk about today is games that involve enlightened self-interest giving, or giving where you're not necessarily giving because you feel generous, but you're giving because the game mechanisms either make you give or strongly encourage you to give. And basically, I didn't plan this out ahead of time. I'm just talking as I walk. So I'm just going to think of games as I think of them, and I'll stop when I get home. So I'm going to start with the ultimate of games where you give stuff to other people. In fact, you beg people to take things, and that is Bonanza. Bonanza is a card game, one of the early designs from mega superstar game designer Uwe Rosenberg. In Bonanza, you are planting beans. You are a bean farmer. And at the beginning of the game, you have only 2 bean fields. Now, apparently, somewhere in the lore of Bonanza, they say that getting the 3rd bean field is a trap. I always like getting the 3rd bean field, but I've never played against serious Bonanza players. Anyway, in the game, you plant these beans in one of the 2 fields. And you can only plant one kind of bean in each field. And when you harvest the beans, you get points based on how many of each kind of bean you planted. So, for example, the black beans, I believe, or blue beans you need a lot of them to get points, but there are a lot of them in the deck. Whereas, if I recall, the chili beans, there aren't as many in the deck. They're worth more points, but there aren't as many, so they're harder to get. Okay, so you get the economy of beans that come out of the deck. Now, here's the brilliant and tricky part of Bonanza. When you draw cards in Bonanza, you have to put them like on the far, if you're holding your cards fanned left to right, so if they were in a stack, the card that's leftmost is in the back of the stack, and the card that's rightmost is the front of the stack. When you draw a new card, it goes in the back, and whenever you play a card, you have to play the card that's in front. Now, the genius part of this is that you often don't want to play the card that's in front. If you have a field of blue beans and a field of chili beans, and then you get, I don't remember one of the other kinds of beans, and then you have at the front of your thing a red bean. Well, you don't want red beans because you already have chili beans and blue beans. And the way the rules go, you have to tear up whatever's in that field in order to plant the red beans at your beginning of your turn. So whatever card's at the front of your hand is the card you're going to plant next. But then the way the game works, you must plant the first card, and then you can plant any number of cards after that, or you can give away cards that you have in your hand. And see, the thing is, remember I said when you draw a new card, it has to go in the back. You're not allowed to rearrange your hand. You have to keep your hand in the order that you drew them. And so what you're trying to do in Bonanza is give away these cards to other players. So if someone else is collecting red beans, you might try to get them to take your red bean. You're helping them, but you're doing it because you don't want to spoil the bean field that you're planting before you're ready to harvest it. Enlightened self-interest. So Bonanza is, I would say, the top game in which you end up engaging in the spirit of giving a la Miracle on 34th Street. The second game I'm going to mention is Lords of Waterdeep. Now, Lords of Waterdeep doesn't have a ton of giving, but there is some, and it's really significant. So in Lords of Waterdeep, you are one of the aptly titled Lords of Waterdeep, and you are trying to get points by sending people on missions. And the way that works is you're gathering cubes of different colors which represent wizards and rogues and clerics and fighters. And when you get the right combination of wizards, rogues, clerics, and fighters, then you can complete missions by sending them on these missions. When you do that, then you get the points that are associated with that mission card. Easy peasy. The tricky part comes with 2 things. First off, one of the things you can do in the game is you can build these buildings. And the buildings create worker placement spots that are better than the generic worker placement spots that are on the board. However, when someone goes to the worker placement spot, the person who owns that building gets a bonus. Now, if you go to your own worker placement spot, you don't get a bonus. So you generally don't do that very often, but sometimes you do. But if someone else goes to your spot, you get a bonus, which means that anytime they want to use that resource, they have to consider, is using it worth giving you a bonus to, which I like. I think that's fun. And then second, we have these harbor cards. They're not called harbor cards. I can't remember what they're called. Port docks. The docks. We have these docks cards. Strategy cards. We have these cards. There are cards that you get that are things you can play to interfere with the game in various ways. And in order to get the cards, you send people to this one harbor. Or no, you draw the cards by going to one place, and then you get to play them by going to this harbor. And when you play one of those cards, something happens. Sometimes you can give somebody a required mission which they have to fulfill before they can fulfill any other missions. Sometimes you can make somebody do something else. Sometimes you could move a worker or copy a space and copy the power at another worker space or something. The big thing you can do though, in a lot of these, is share resources. So sometimes you could say everybody has to give me a wizard, and anyone who doesn't have a wizard, I get a gold from the bank instead. Or a lot of times it'll say, like, I take 3 wizards and I pick one other player to get 1 wizard, which works really nice and is a good way to create this sort of situation in which you have to give stuff to other players. So Lords of Waterdeep has 2 different mechanisms by which you are giving things to other players as you take your action. And I like that. Another game that has a little bit of giving is Everdell. In Everdell, you are building up a village. We've talked about Everdell a number of times. If you're interested in knowing more about that game in particular, I have a duel of Everdell versus Wingspan. You can go read about that. You can go check out the show notes, and I'll have a link to that. However, some of the cards in Everdell have this similar thing where you're giving stuff to other people. Sometimes it's get a thing for giving a thing. I believe that the monk gets, either the monk or the shepherd gets something by giving things to other people. The postal pigeon gets things by giving things to other people. And this allows for you to gain things as you go along, and generally you gain the best stuff, but it also requires you to give things to other people too. So there's this interesting trade-off where you're deciding, do I want other people to have it? Since I bring up Everdell, another game that actually has a lot more of the kind of give to other people thing is Wingspan. In Wingspan, there are cards where the powers of the cards result in other people getting things. Like it'll say you and one other player get X. But then also there are a number of powers in Wingspan where it triggers when another player does something. So you kind of add a condition onto their game where they have to decide, do I want to trigger my egg row again, knowing that you'll get to do a thing? Now, Wingspan does allow you, if you're careful, to manipulate that. Like, for instance, if somebody's got a scavenging bird that gets to roll every time you take food, you might manage it in such a way that you take all the food you take the last die from the bird feeder, so there's no dice outside the bird feeder. So then when the person's scavenging action triggers, there's nothing to trigger. You could do something like that, but it's hard. And generally what you want to do is just do your thing, and sometimes they get a bonus. And then there's a whole branch of game genre that encourages you to give stuff to other people. And these are games that allow for king-making in various ways. There are a variety of different games where you have to choose how you are going to attack another player or what kind of move you're going to make. And a big part of what you're trying to decide as you're making those moves is in what way you want to interfere with the other players. And sometimes the best move is to interfere with the other players by giving stuff to the player who's in the worst position, because that player then will hopefully be able to do better, but also not get in your way. Now, if you are the last place player and you find yourself in a position where you can help someone else, then you have the situation we sometimes call king-making, where if you help the second place player, then now they have enough to get past the first place player. By contrast, if you help the first place player, they're guaranteed to win. If you help the third place player, maybe they can pull the second place down and reduce the competition that guarantees first place win. There's almost no good solution in a game like that. And it takes a tricky balance to avoid it. Well, that's about what I can think of in terms of games where you're giving things to other people, but I would love to hear some more ideas. So head over to Board Game Geek Guild 3269 and let me know of games that you can think of where you have this sort of complex giving matrix where the game promotes you giving things to people, but in a very specific way. I can't wait to hear what you come up with. If you want to reach out to me directly, you can email me, Brendan@Rattlebox Games, or send me a direct message on Board Game Geek to Wombat929. Thanks for joining me on my walk today. I hope that your next walk is as pleasant as mine was. Bye-bye.
Brought to you by Rattlebox Games.